This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here he is, the host of the podcast, AWR Hawkins.
Welcome to Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart News podcast focused on guns, gun rights, the Second Amendment. As you know, we always sum these things up here under the banner of freedom. Always have, always will. Folks, great week this week, really, as far as gun news goes. And by that, I mean, you know, it's another week that we have before the Democrats come in and take over in the House. And yeah, I've already said it enough. I don't want to belabor the point, but once they're in, it's going to be gun control push after gun control push after gun control push. The only thing that will interrupt those pushes are the numerous investigations they want to launch into Trump in order to slow him down. And that's what we're going to have for 2 more years because they will be in the majority. But this week, they're not, and it was a good week. We have a lot of news to cover, a lot of news. We had some news that makes a case that it's tragic, but we need to hear it. We covered at Breitbart. The investigation into the Parkland shooting has uncovered the fact that the Parkland shooter paused 5 times during his attack. He paused 5 times to reload. Now, the point here is simple. If a teacher had been armed, they could have taken him out. 5 times he paused during his attack to reload. Folks, I know you'll remember, I've talked to you before about Sandy Hook. The Sandy Hook attack that the left tries to spin and spin and spin for more and more gun control. In that attack, the attacker had over 9 minutes without armed response because he struck a school that was a gun-free zone. The teachers could not be armed. And so he could ply his trade without interruption. He faced no armed response for over 9 minutes. That's the Sandy Hook attacker. And then fast forward to 2018, February 14th, 2018, the Parkland attacker had the same exact situation. He was in a school where the teachers aren't allowed to be armed, and he paused 5 times to reload his firearm. Folks, it's horrendous when you think about it. It's inhumane when you think about it. Those teachers were at the mercy of that gunman. They were at his mercy. And I don't think anything exemplifies it or anything illustrates it better, I should say, than the fact that at his leisure he could pause and reload. It's sickening, absolutely sickening. Folks, I'll remember, and I don't know if you remember, but if you haven't read it, you can look it up. At Breitbart, I covered a Virginia Tech Review Board report. In April 2007, so the date of the attack was April, I believe, 16th, 2007. The Virginia attack occurred, and a guy killed 32 people with a handgun. And he actually had 2 handguns with him, but that's what he used. The weapon was a handgun. Killed 32 people. And the Virginia Tech University did a review. They did a review of that attack. And, you know, because people said, well, if he had not had high capacity magazines, then he wouldn't have killed as many people. The review board said, no, it had nothing to do with it. Had nothing to do with it. Why? Because he had time on his side. Why did he have time on his side? Because no one was armed but him. He didn't have to worry about anything, folks. No one could shoot back. No one could harm him. He moved at his own pace. And just like the Parkland shooter, he could pause to reload when he wanted. There was no reason to be in a hurry. What was going to stop him? Folks, it's past time. We have got to make it a cause to arm teachers. I mean, it has got to be something we're passionate about. We're writing our representatives, our senators about. Something, if we're in states where it's allowable already, then something that we're writing our school districts about, emailing them about, writing our governors about. Folks, there's no reason that teachers are disarmed. There's none. Now, I'm going to say this to be clear. I don't believe a teacher ought to be forced to be armed, period. No way. But they ought to have the choice to be armed if they want to be. Everybody will always say, well, I don't know a single teacher that wants to be armed. Well, maybe I know 6 of them. So those that you know who don't want to be armed, that's dandy. They don't want to be armed, that's fine. But those who do want to be armed need to be able to be armed, because I cannot think of anything more humane than being trapped, sheltering in place, while the guy who's attacking you has so much leisure time at that moment. He slowly reloads, methodically walks, takes his time, because no one can stop him. I can't think of anything more inhumane. As a matter of fact, the sheriff in, I believe it's Pinellas County in Florida, he was against arming teachers until the investigation turned up that the Parkland shooter paused 5 times. And now the Pinellas County sheriff said, look, we got to arm teachers. They're the ones who could stop this. And I appreciate his logic. I appreciate his willingness to think. See, a lot of times we close the doors. We won't think. We have our position, we're dug in. There's no reason to fear thinking about something. Hypocrisy is the only thing that fears thinking about something, right? Truth is not afraid to be tested. Hypocrisy is afraid to be tested. So if your position is the true one, if your position is the correct one, there's no fear in having a discussion about it. And if you realize your position's wrong, then you change it. That's what the Pinellas County Sheriff did, and I appreciate that he was willing to do that, because he is now going to be a fervent supporter of arming teachers. He's going to be an ambassador for that cause. And hopefully that will result in teachers being armed, which will result in turn in both teachers and students being saved, because there is absolutely zero excuse for an environment where a gunman can walk around, reload at his leisure, spend over 9 minutes in the school, nothing to worry about like he did at Sandy Hook. Absolutely no excuse for that. It is inhumane, period. I mean, that's it. Inhumane. End of discussion. Folks, we had some crazy news this week. The Detroit City Council adopted an ammo tax and mental background checks for ammo purchases. Now, I fear that there are some people that hear that and they go, well, that's not such a bad thing, a mental background check for ammo purchase. Folks, it's a terrible thing. The words shall not be infringed mean shall not be infringed. Once the government asserts itself or inserts itself between the individual and his or her rights, those rights are simply privileges. They really are. Now, they're still rights, but they're treated like privileges. And now you have to get the government's permission to exercise them. That's what the Detroit City Council is saying. They didn't use those words, but they're saying, if you want bullets, you got to do this our way. If you want bullets, you have to get permission. How do you get permission? You get permission by passing the mental background check. You get permission by paying the tax on the ammo. Whatever the government sets it, whatever they set it, that's how you get permission. Now look, people, what this does, number one, the tax will make ammo cost prohibitive for poor citizens. And as my friend John Lott has pointed out, it's often the poorer citizens who need the gun more than anybody. Now they're going to have their gun, but they're not going to be able to afford the ammo to use for self-defense. And folks, the mental background check is not going to be cost-free. Someone's got to pay it. Who's going to pay that? Will there be a fee for each of those background checks? If so, again, ammo becoming more and more cost prohibitive. Folks, this is craziness. It really is. It really is. And the craziest thing is the original sponsor of this, Wayne County Commissioner Reggie Davis, he thinks this is going to somehow curb crime. Does he not know gang members and street criminals, they don't walk into the local store to buy their ammo. They're not going to be paying this tax. You know who's going to pay this tax? The law-abiding citizen. The same people that are harmed by every gun control that is put in place. Folks, you know what? I'm going to hit this story real quick. This is important. We covered this week. 97.8% of mass shootings since 1950 have occurred in gun-free zones. Let me say that again. 97.8% of mass shootings since 1950 have occurred in gun-free zones. And the exact figure is 1950 to May 2018. 97.8% of those have occurred in gun-free zones. Folks, this dovetails perfectly with what I was saying a while ago about Sandy Hook, about Parkland, about Virginia Tech. See, the important thing was not the type of magazine they had, the capacity of it, so on and so forth. It was not even the type of firearm they had. That's not what was important. What was important was that they had time on their side. And why do they have time on their side? Because they're the only ones who were armed. And of course, those are just shootings. Those three examples are just shootings at educational facilities, high schools and colleges. But 97.8% of all mass shootings, whether they're at the workplace, at a church, at a mall, wherever they are, 97.8 of them from 1950 till May 2018, 97.8% of them occur in a gun-free zone. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, that figure comes from the Crime Prevention Research Center. And that's John Lott's outlet. They do some incredible number crunching there and statistics. But it's just so hard, because here's what we have. Whenever there is a shooting, like they had the recent one that we covered at Breitbart at Chicago Mercy Hospital, all right? Whenever there's a shooting, people immediately call for more gun control. But what they do in doing that is they fail to admit that the problem is a failure of gun control. The problem is that the gun-free zones are failing. They're trapping people. And people are being gunned down. We don't need another gun control law. We need to repeal one or two. And one of the first ones we need to repeal in all its variations are these gun-free zones. They've got to go. They've got to go. But instead what the left does is they pounce on an attack immediately, say this proves that we need more gun laws. And I'm just telling you, no. When 97.8% of mass shootings, no matter where they've occurred, when 97.8% of those from 1950 to May 2018, when they're occurring in gun-free zones, there's your easy solution. Get rid of those zones. Now look, here's the thing. This is a point that betrays the left's real interests. Now understand what I'm saying. The left tries to tell us they want our safety. They want our security. Well, if they did, if I told you that 97.8% of some type of death was caused by this or that, wouldn't you think, well, then I'm going to remove whatever that is, because that's nearly 100%. So if I say 97.8% of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones, if I'm on the left, if I'm on the right, if I'm in the middle, wherever I am, if my concern is really safety, my response would be, well, then let's get rid of those gun-free zones. But that's not how the left responds, because they're not really after safety. They're after control. That's why it's called gun control. And the control is the part they really want. The gun-free zones contribute to death. Gun-free zones are killing fields, period. But the left doesn't want to change that. The left doesn't want to change that, because to introduce firearms as a means of safety, and that's exactly what's happening. If you remove a gun-free zone, you're saying that the law-abiding citizen can carry a gun for self-defense. To introduce that mindset is to counter the very mindset that plays out 24/7 on CNN, MSNBC, the rest of the establishment media, and in the Democrat Party. And they just can't do that. They can't afford to let Americans experience freedom to that degree. And why do they fear? They fear they'll lose control. And that doesn't mean they fear there'll be riots or lawlessness. No, they fear that Americans will realize that we are to be independent. In other words, we are to be free. We are to live in the freedom that our founders claimed for us and protected, that our founders passed to us via the Bill of Rights. Okay? Now look, folks, one other thing real quick. I mentioned the Chicago Mercy Hospital shooting. This is just critical. I want to just point this out. The gunman in that situation got all of his guns legally. How many times have we been through that scenario? He got all his guns legally. And that means he passed his background checks. He did everything. Folks, that's another lie of the left. If only we had universal background checks. Folks, we've had background checks since 1998. Since 1998. They don't stop a determined attacker from getting a gun, folks. I guess I could just title this first segment of the podcast very simply. This is the title. Ready? Gun control is not the solution. And if I have a subtitle, it would be Gun Control is the Problem. Gun control is not the solution, folks. But gun control is the problem. You're listening to Bullets with AWR Hawkins. We'll be back right after this.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Jeannie in Pennsylvania.
I think we've gotten away from what we really hired him to do, which is draining the swamp. If you look at the real picture of draining a swamp, you go in and you take all the water out of it. What does it leave? It leaves the gunk. He cannot get rid of the gunk. We have to get rid of the gunk. Everything he's doing, he's lowering the water so we can see who needs to go. The only way they can go is if we vote them out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is AWR Hawkins.
Welcome back to Bullets with AWR Hawkins. Folks, I'm reading a book right now. I hope each of you read. I hope you take time to read. You know, I'll tell you one way that you can become an incredible writer. Well, I'll just say, let me word it this way. One way you can become a better writer is to read. When you read, it does something for your writing, your thinking skills. And of course, you have to be reading good books. But I encourage each of you to read and read good books, you know, and I've done this from time to time with this podcast. And I'm reading a book right now by Stephen Holbrook, The Founders' Second Amendment. Folks, it's unbelievable. It's a history lesson and a Second Amendment primer all wrapped into one. And by that, I mean this. What Stephen does, and he's a friend, what he does is he goes through, starts roughly late 1600s and goes through to the American Revolution. And the first part is very quick. And then he gets into the 1760s and the 1770s. And he stays there a while. And he shows how King George incrementally, how the crown incrementally tightened the screws on the colonists, how they put this tax on them and that tax on them, how they threatened to confiscate their firearms, how they not only threatened to confiscate their gunpowder, but did confiscate their gunpowder, how the crown planned to stop the colonists from buying ammunition supplies from Great Britain. And the whole goal is easy. The guns they didn't seize, they were going to make of no point because there was going to be no ammunition to shoot out of them. I mean, it was a great plan. It was a great plan that played out. And, you know, as Stephen goes through this and you're reading it, what he wants you to do, and this is his strength, by the way, he's not making an argument. Here's what the Second Amendment means. Here's what the founders were saying. He's not doing that. He's presenting history so that you can see in the founders' own words what they said. You see what I'm saying? So he's not making an application. He's not saying, well, here's what they meant. No, he says, he gives you a quote. He gives you a quote from Sam Adams. He gives you a quote from John Adams. He gives you myriad quotes from John Hancock or Thomas Jefferson, any number of the founders, myriad quotes. And you see this history playing out. You see how Pennsylvania reacted to the Crown's actions. You see how Rhode Island reacted, or you see how Massachusetts reacted. Massachusetts, as a matter of fact, passed a law that everybody had to be armed. You have to be armed. Why? Because being armed is part of being prepared in case we have to call everybody together to fend off this menace, the Crown. And what happens as you're reading this book, here's what you realize. Now, you know the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You have people, they'll either say, well, it's supposed to be a well-regulated militia. And if they say that it's a collective right. Or you have people that say, well, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And they say it's an individual right. Well, what you understand as you read Stephen's book, and you could read, it wouldn't hurt to read an article I wrote at Breitbart called a well-regulated militia, the basis for private gun ownership. That's also a good piece for you to read. A well-regulated militia, the basis for private gun ownership. But as you read Stephen's book, what you realize is our founders wanted Americans, not military members. And of course, for those of you who are military members or in military families, I am in no way putting down our military or our members. But I'm just talking about the history as it was. Our founders wanted the colonists and Americans after our founding to be able to come together in an instant and repel a tyranny. It's that simple. You know how many times I've referenced Federalist 46. They wanted Americans to be able to come together in an instant and repel a tyranny. Now, when they came together, what would they form? They would form a well-regulated militia. But prior to coming together, what must happen? They must have arms. They must have arms to come together. So you see, it's not what I'm saying to you, it's not an either or. It's a both and. Our founders wanted us to be able to come together collectively in a militia. They did. To repel a tyranny. And that will be a truth. So no matter how long America lives, it will always be true that our founders want us in a situation where the citizens can band together and repel a tyranny. That'll always be a truth. All right? And it will also always be true that they will want individual citizens to possess guns, private gun ownership. Because without the possession of guns, without the private gun ownership, there is no way that the citizens could band together and repel a tyranny. You see how it works? So it is an individual right. It's an individual right that we exercise individually on a day-by-day basis. But it is also a right for which there is a reservation of sorts. In other words, there is a time when we will exercise it collectively if need be. If a tyranny must be repelled. And you see this as you read Stephen's book. And for instance, I'm just going to say this and I'm going to move on, but I'm trying to tell you why this book is so great. You know, he discusses how the gunpowder for the muskets and different things were kept in a common storage area. Maybe 250 barrels of gunpowder, maybe 300 barrels in some cities or towns. And what happened is when the Crown became serious about clamping down on the colonists, including about disarming them, they would send soldiers in the night who would take all the gunpowder from the central storage facilities in the colonial towns and cities. And when the colonists wake up, they have no way to fire. They have no way to fire their muskets unless they had saved a little gunpowder themselves back at their home. Now, see, when I read that, I'm reminded why that all this talk, and you see it in Europe a lot, but why all this talk is so worthless that, well, I'm not against you owning guns, but I would like you to have to store them at a sporting facility or at a range or what. If you have to keep your gun somewhere other than with your person, then what you're doing, you're putting yourself far enough away from it that it can be taken by the enemy. And then you might as well have a hammer. Or your bullets can be taken. See, if you look, that's exactly the situation they had. They were storing all of that powder together, and the British could just come in and take it. And once they did that, maybe you still got a gun, big deal. You have no ammunition. I'm just telling you, folks, as you read Stephen's book, all these things led up to the Second Amendment. As you read his book, you understand why it was so crucial to the founders, not simply that we own guns, but that we possessed them. See, right? Not just that we keep them, but that we bear them, right? Then they're ours. And you understand why private gun ownership is so important. I invite you to read it. The Founders' Second Amendment by Stephen Holbrook. It is exceptional. And those of you who, I'm going to say this, if any of you listen to me teach high school history, and I don't know the flexibility you get there, but if you teach college for sure, or teach at the university, you can incorporate Stephen's book into your class lessons. All right. So maybe you may want to weigh my advice twice, because you know I used to teach and now I don't. So maybe it's not that good. It's not that good if you interweave it. No, I'm kidding. You can get so much history out of what he's pulled together. He's done yeoman's work. It's the work of a scholar, and it's incredible. The Founders' Second Amendment. Now, folks, Think Progress is a little leftist organization, and I don't really think much about them. I don't think their impact's that great. I think they hit their peak under Clinton. Maybe I'm wrong, but they're of such little consequence most of the time that I don't pay attention to them. But they came out with something so loony over Thanksgiving, I couldn't ignore it. They got upset with the fact that there is a ban on romaine lettuce, but no ban on firearms. If you wrecked your car when I said it, I apologize. It sounds illogical, I know, but I'm being honest with you. They got upset that there was a ban over Thanksgiving on romaine lettuce, but no ban on firearms. I looked and looked. I got out my Bill of Rights and looked, and I did not see anywhere in the Bill of Rights where, my right to purchase and eat romaine lettuce would not be infringed. I didn't see that. I did not see that. I did see it about firearms, though. I did see it about firearms. See, the left is just so crazy. And this goes back to my first point in the podcast tonight. Folks, what we've done, I don't know if you realize it, for the last 2 years, we've grown accustomed to being without the lunatics. But once the Democrats take control of the House, it's going to be the kind of gun control push we saw under Obama, week after week after week. At times, there will be times where they'll take a short break, and that'll be because they're trying to raise our taxes or somehow demolish our military or otherwise weaken our country. But there'll be a relentless push for gun control. All right. And it's because people like you think of at Think Progress, those kind of people have been elected. Those are the kinds of people who were elected a few weeks ago, and they are at war with our right to keep and bear arms. Seriously, it's an all-out war, and so just be ready for it. But understand, we're going to be hearing laws pushed by the kinds of people who get upset that we ban romaine lettuce and we don't ban firearms. No joke. Now, look, folks. This is a big point to me. We covered this week up in Washington State, there's a prosecutor who wants to expand red flag laws to include people who are too young to buy firearms. Let me say it again. In Washington State, there's an effort to expand red flag laws to include people who are too young to buy firearms. Now, here's the only thing I want to point out. This is why I hate red flag laws. That's what I want to point out. This is why I hate them. For the same reason when I talked about the mental health background checks for ammo purchases, once you let the government between you and your right, I hate to tell you, but it's not going to feel that much like a right. It's going to feel like a privilege. And once you open the door to a court-issued order for firearm confiscation, then the bureaucrats can just step in and slowly expand it. Expand who can keep a right to bear arms and who must forfeit it. And that's what we're seeing right here. In Washington State, now they want to expand it so that people who are already too young to buy guns, so that gun confiscation orders can be issued for them. So I'm not worried about the merits of whether that's good or bad. I'm worried about the fact that it's a war on the Second Amendment. Folks, you're listening to Bullets with AWR Hawkins. We'll be back right after this.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
Well, if you're not a globalist, if you're not a citizen of the world, then you must be let me check my PC handbook. Oh, there it is, right there in the book. You can't say that you're a nationalist, especially if you're a white man, because then it must mean that you are a white nationalist.
Sonny's Corner, Saturday at 1 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125. This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is AWR Hawkins.
Welcome back to Bullets with AWR Hawkins. Folks, I just want to conclude by sharing with you a story. You know, I love stories of the Second Amendment in action. And in Warren, Ohio, a homeowner was asleep. He and his family were home asleep, and he heard glass breaking, and his name's Ken York. And he said he was making all kinds of noise. I thought burglars were supposed to be quiet. And Ken reacted to the sound by grabbing his gun, moving toward the sound, and there was a confrontation. And the suspect, Ken says the suspect looked at his gun and said, "What size gun is that?" And Ken responded, "Big enough to kill you." He said at that point, which makes no sense, the suspect then lunges at him. So he shoots him, all right? Afterward, Ken said, "What are you supposed to do? I can buy other stuff, but I can't replace my life or hers," speaking about his wife. And the police praised him. They praised him for the actions he took. All right. And I love the story. I love the story because there you have it. You have a law-abiding citizen and his wife asleep, and somebody just decides they're going to break in and take what's his. And it didn't work out that way. Why? Because Ken had a firearm. All right. Folks, this story is brought to you by the Second Amendment. Folks, thanks for listening to Bullets with AWR Hawkins this week. I hope you'll get your friends, your family members, your coworkers, your neighbors, get them all to go to the site and subscribe and go to iTunes, and it'll download every Tuesday to your phone. It's no problem, and it's free. And while you do your commute or while you're driving, back from a long trip, like I know Martine and Ron are right now, while you're doing whatever you're doing, you can just listen to it. Let it play in the background, all right? And listen, folks, until we're together again, always remember, more guns equal more freedom.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
A lot of people not knowing what action they could or should take to make the difference. What I do is try to turn people on to sites like Breitbart, people who are writing and publishing the truth so that people will get educated. But, you kind of can't blame productive members of society who are kind of confused, perplexed as to what do we do to take this government back.
Sirius XM Patriot Channel 125.